Because Zend only provides rudimentary tools for handling database access, creating the model is going to be a very customized and frankly cumbersome exercise. That said, it's really not that different from creating a generic PHP application. You create the database in SQL, you create a class or set of classes to interact with the database, and you create a class to represent the data in PHP object-oriented programming format. Fortunately, the Zend command line tool is there to provide a little assistance. The first thing to know is structural. Zend is going to use a front controller class to load different modules, which are aspects of our application. Basically, everything that's in the application directory in the Zend project is a module. In fact, this is the default module of your application. An instance of a module autoloader class is created every time the bootstrap is initialized and is going to use the prefix of that model. In our case, it's going to be application underscore. So our model, table, and form classes are all going to have that prefix. The first thing you need to do in order to interact with the database is we need to edit our application.ini file. We need to set a few parameters that are going to specifically determine how our Zend application will talk to the database. So these are all going to be in the resources element, and they're all also going to be in the sub-element DB. The first one is the adapter type. In this case, we're going to call it PDO_MySQL. We're going to use PHP's data object models to handle everything. And that kind of happens behind the scenes. The next element we're going to create is going to be in the params. In fact, all the rest of them will be params. And these are just how it's going to interact with the database. In this case, it's the host, which is localhost. Because we're using a non-standard port with MAMP, we need to specify that as well. If you're using 3306, it's not crucial that you do this. Sorry, this should be port. Then we're going to type in our DB name, which is the name of our database, PHP_frameworks_test. Resources.db.params. The username that we're going to use to access the database, in this case root. It's not always the best practice to use the root, but since I'm just in a development environment here, it should work just fine. And make sure you spell all these correctly. It can be easy when you're typing a lot to make mistakes. The password, you'll put whatever your password is. And that should pretty much set up everything so that it can be accessed. So this allows database access from your application to whatever your database is, whether it's in MySQL or in another type of database. You can also use the Zend command line tool to do this by typing zf configure db-adapter at the command line. Now, where you go from here, Zend is pretty much agnostic about. You could create your own custom model if you wanted to. You could use Doctrine. You could use the Zend_DB class, which uses a special pattern called the Table Data Gateway or Row Data Gateway. We're going to use this Zend DB table, which uses the data mapper pattern. It's what they use in the Zend Quick Start docs, and it seems to be sort of the default usage, so we're going to use that. In order to do this, the first thing we'll need to do is create a class that is going to represent the DB table. Go to our command line. We can use the special command zf create db-table to do this. And first you're going to name whatever you want to call your DB table. In this case, we're just going to call it mail list. And then you specify the name of the table in the database that this is going to correspond to. Note that I'm still in the Explore Zend folder in the htdocs directory of my MAMP. So it created a new file for me, maillist.php. And if I go back to my text, you can see in the models directory, I now have a new folder, DB table, and I have a maillist.php. And inside of it, I'm creating this class, application model DB table mail list, and it's setting the database table to mailing list. This file will also store the name of the data table in the _name protected variable. Now let's create our value object or data transfer object, which is going to hold the data. It's going to essentially have a property for each of the fields in our database table. We can go back to the command line and we can use a tool, create model, and you simply call it whatever you want to call it. In this instance, we're going to call it mail list, and it will create a new class for us directly in the models directory. There's nothing in this class, however, So we're going to have to copy and paste some information that I've already used to create this data. Let's take a look at the code that we have here. Notice that we have a protected variable that corresponds basically with each of the field names inside my database table, but it starts with an underscore. Then if you scroll down, you'll see that I have a get and a set property that correspond to each of those, and they'll each take some kind of value for the set, or they'll return some kind of value for the get. So this is essentially a way of interacting with this data and saving one record from the database. The last thing we'll need to do is create our mapper. The mapper is what's going to provide the functionality to integrate between this data, which is the Zend application, and the data that's persisting in the database. Again, from the command line, I can create another class, create model, and we'll call this mail list mapper. And if you noticed last time, all it really does when you run create model is create an empty class for you. It doesn't actually write any of the methods or give you any head start on anything, but it's a quick way to get the class created. So I'm going to go ahead and copy in some information. I've already created a mapper class, and this mapper class has the core functionality that I need. This mapper class stores the DB table that is used to access that database table. If you remember, the DB table abstract has a number of methods built into it that allow us to interact with the database. So by creating an instance of it, we create a mapping to our database. So I've created this public function save. It takes one argument, which is our data object. It then sets all of the variables to an array. The field names of the array correspond to the names in our database. We can then just call the simple insert or update method that will then do all the work to the database that we need to do. So this is one example where you do get a little bit of a shortcut, a little bit of help from Zend, and that's that abstract class that's providing this information. So as you've seen, Zend is really a model agnostic framework, which is to say you can basically do things how you like. It does provide a few classes that represent some common patterns. ZendDB is one of them, and the one we went over here is ZendDB table. These can help you get started, but if you want to use something different, either your own system or Doctrine or another kind of ORM, it's not only acceptable, but it'll likely save you time in the long run.